In 1941, Japan made one of the most dangerous decisions in modern history. A decision that changed entire world. A decision that turned a regional war in Asia into a true global conflict. Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. Hundreds of aircrafts appeared around the Hawaii without warning. Battleships exploded. American soldiers died in flames. The United States entered the World War II. Question appeared immediately. Why would Japan do that? Why would Japan attack a country with far larger economy, far larger industry, and far greater military potential? Because even many Japanese leaders understood something terrifying. Japan probably could not win a long-term war against the United States. And yet, they attacked anyway. To understand why, you have to take a look at the problem Japan faced before Pearl Harbor. Because by 1941, Japan was concerned. For decades, Japan had been expanding aggressively across the Asia. Unlike countries like United States and the Soviet Union, Japan has limited natural resources. It lacked large domestic oil resources. It lacked many critical raw materials which were needed for modern industry, and it depended heavily on the import to survive. But Japan was also becoming increasingly militarized. Its army was growing. Its navy was expanding. Its factories demanded more resources every year. And military leaders believed that Japan needed to become the dominated military in Asia before Western powers could stop them, especially the United States and British Empire. In 1930s, Japan expanded China. The war became massively brutal and hard. Entires of cities were burned. Millions of civilians were suffered. The conflict dragged far longer than Japan even expected. And the deeper Japan moved into China, the more resources it concerned, especially oil. Modern warfare depends on fuel. Ships, aircrafts, tanks, factories, all they needed fuel. And Japan imported most of it from abroad, especially from the United States. This created a dangerous contradiction. Japan was building an empire while depending on the very country that could shut its economy down. And eventually, that is what's exactly started happening. The United States watched Japan's expansion with a growing concern. And American leaders feared that Japan could dominate Asia and threatened American interests in Pacific. And at first, the United States responded gradually. Economic pressure increased, trade restrictions expanded, and diplomatic tensions grew. But then, Japan moved into French Indochina. Today, this region includes Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. And this situation alarmed the United States even more, because now Japan was being positioning itself as more expansion towards the Southeast Asia, a region that was rich with oil and critical resources. And in 1941, America made a decision that shocked Japan's leadership. The United States froze Japanese assets and placed an embargo to the oil on Japan. And this was catastrophic. Suddenly, Japan faced the problem to be run out of the fuel. And without oil, Japan's military machine would slowly down. Its navy could not operate. Its aircraft could not fly. Its tanks could not run. Its empire could not expand, and its economy could collapse. Japan now faced a terrifying countdown. Some people thought that Japan had only enough 1 to 2 years oil resources to continue military expansion. The clock was ticking, and at this point, Japan faced several possible choices, and one of them was compromise. Japan could reduce its expansion, withdraw from the parts of China, accept American demands, and avoid war. But many military leaders saw this as humiliation. They believed Japan had already sacrificed too much. Too many soldiers had died, and too many resources had been invested. And backing down now seemed unacceptable. And another option was extremely dangerous: seize all the resources, especially the rich oil territories on the Southeast Asia. Places like the Dodged East Indies, now this region called Indonesia. The region contained a lot of oil resources Japan extremely desperately needed. But there was a problem. The United States fleet sat in Hawaii, and Japanese military planners feared that if Japan expanded southward, the American fleet could interfere. This fear helped shape on one of the most famous military operations in history, attack on Pearl Harbor. And Japanese leaders hoped for something very specific. Of course, they did not believe that they can completely conquer the United States, and instead, they hoped to shock America so badly that the United States would negotiate. This was a gamble. Japan believed that the devastating surprise attack could cripple American naval power long enough for Japan to rapidly seize the territory across the Pacific. And then, after building a massive defensive perimeter, Japan hoped America would eventually accept the peace. Some Japanese leaders compared this strategy to delivering a massive psychological blow. Strike hard enough, and maybe the enemy will lose the ability to fight. But this strategy depended on many dangerous assumptions, and many of them were wrong. The attack itself began on December 7th, 1941, early in the morning. Japanese aircrafts launched from the carriers far away in the Pacific Ocean. The operation was carefully planned. The pilots were training expensively, and the surprise was critical. Attack looked devastating. Battleships were destroyed. Aircraft were wrecked on the ground. Thousands of Americans were killed or wounded, and smoke covered Pearl Harbor. For Japan, the operation initially appeared to be a success, but underneath the destruction, several critical problems remained, and this problem would extremely become very important later in the war. One of the biggest issues was that the American carriers were not in the Pearl Harbor during the attack, and this mattered enormously because aircraft carriers would eventually become dominated in the Pacific. Japan damaged battleships, but the future of naval warfare was already changing. Another major problem, Japan failed to destroy key repair facilities and fuel storages infrastructures at Pearl Harbor, and this allowed the United States to recover much faster than they thought. And most importantly, instead of terrifying America into surrender, the attack united the country completely. Before Pearl Harbor, many Americans wanted to avoid entering another war, and after Pearl Harbor, public opinion exploded in anger. The United States was no longer divided. The country was fully mobilized for war. And Japan had now just awakened the largest industrial economy on Earth. This would become the greatest strategical problem Japan had ever faced, because America's industrial capacity was almost impossible to match. The United States could build ships faster than Japan could attack and destroy them. It could produce enormous numbers of aircrafts. It had massive access to oil, steel, manpower, and manufacturing resources. Meanwhile, Japan was already struggling with limited resources. And the longer the war continued, the greater this imbalance became. At first, Japan expanded rapidly. It captured huge territories across the Pacific, Philippines, Hong Kong, Malaya, Singapore. For a brief moment, Japan seemed unstoppable. But underneath these victories, same problem would existed. Resources, especially fuel. Japan was now controlling a lot of big areas, but defending them across the Pacific Ocean was extremely difficult. Supply lanes stretched across enormous distances. Ships became vulnerable. American submarines began targeting Japanese shipping, and slowly Japan's ability to sustain the war was collapsing. And then came another turning point, the Battle of Midway in 1942. Only months after Pearl Harbor, Japan lost 4 major aircraft carriers. The defeat shocked Japanese Navy, and unlike the United States, Japan struggled to replace its losses. Experienced pilots became harder to replace. Industrial production lagged under the United States, harder output. Fuel storages became increasingly severe. From this point, Japan started losing strategic momentum. As war continued, America's industrial power became overwhelming. New American ships entered the Pacific constantly. Factories operated at enormous scale. American aircraft production exploded. Meanwhile, Japanese cities faced bombing campaigns. Supply chains weakened. Oil storages became catastrophic. By the final years of the war, Japan still had dangerous soldiers, but the system underneath the empire was collapsing. Fuel was disappearing, industry was failing, shipping losses were devastating. Pilots received less training because the fuel resources were limited. Japan reached a point where it could no longer sustain a modern war. This is why many historians view Pearl Harbor as both a tactical success and a massive strategic disaster. The attack damaged the United States temporarily, but it also guaranteed something far more dangerous: total American involvement in the war. Japan hoped to weaken America's will to fight. The United States became fully committed to destroy the Japanese empire. And once America's economy fully mobilized, Japan faced an opponent with vastly superior industrial power and resources. An opponent capable of fighting very long war. Exactly the kind of war Japan was not prepared to sustain. By 1945, Japan was collapsing. Cities were burning, industry was shattered, and fuel resources were nearly exhausted. American forces moved closer and closer to the Japanese mainland, and the empire that once was expanding rapidly into Asia was now facing fatal defeat. That's why Pearl Harbor remains one of the most famous attacks in the modern history. But behind the explosions, behind the battleships, behind the surprise attack, the deeper story was about fear, resources, oil, and desperation. Japan attacked Pearl Harbor because its leaders were believed that the time is running out. And in trying to solve one strategic crisis, they created an event larger catastrophe. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe for more cinematic history documentations about the crisis, turning points, and history mistakes that changed the world forever.